Well, hello and welcome to the next segment of Abstract Approaches. I've decided to actually change approaches this morning, and that's something that I do a lot in my teaching and in my work. So I figure that if you're new to learning with me, I may as well just lay it out on the line right now that I often work very spontaneously and I work in response to the things that are going on around me. So if that's in an in-person workshop, then often it'll be like the energy of the group or a particular person that I sense needs something, so that I will actually, create a demonstration or a technique right there on the spot to help that person get through whatever it is they need to get through. And in turn, that then helps the rest of the group. So it's kind of how I work. I don't really plan things out. I have a basic loose structure of what I'm going to be teaching, but then I'm really open always to just wherever the energy takes me, spontaneous happenings, accidents that can turn into amazing discoveries, just inspiration from the environment is really important. And so these are all things that we're going to be talking about when I release Abstract Mojo, which is the huge class that's going to be covering so much more than what we can do in these two lessons. But this is just a little taster for you all, and so I hope you're enjoying it. So here we are out in my garden. It's springtime in Australia right now, so you'll hear lots of birds, and we have beautiful bottlebrush flowers in bloom, and I just thought it'd be lovely to sit out here and chat with you for a bit. So we finished up in the last segment with a whole wall full of small mini abstracts, and we were working through the embracing the contrast ideas of looking at the flow and energy of what we have already going on in a piece, and then seeing if we can add in something that was a contrasting element. So for example, we looked at whether there were too many bold lines in a piece and then added some delicate lines, or we looked at if the energy was flowing or too loose, then perhaps we might need to add in a little bit of structure. So I hope that you got the gist of what I was coming at with that, and I will be exploring it a lot more. There'll be a whole week devoted to embracing the contrast in the new class. So what I decided to do this morning, coming out and looking at all of these pieces on the wall, was to actually take them off the wall, because I didn't feel like I could resolve every single one of them in a mini class. That would just take a whole lot more time, I think. But what I wanted to do, and as I mentioned to you earlier, this exercise was not really an exercise to get us to a point where we had 15 successful pieces. I really wanted it to just be a way for you to explore this idea of embracing the contrast, and as a new idea to work with, and then just to see where it would take you. So to not be so attached to everything coming out, as a magnificent success. So I'm happy to leave these, most of them where they are, but I want to pick just a couple of them, and I want to take them one step further for you. So just to show you a few other techniques that I might use to either bring a bit of cohesion to a piece that's lacking in cohesion, a bit of unity, or perhaps just to take it one step further, or to actually transform what is on the piece at the moment. So, and that's something I love to do, because, sometimes we get stuck. Often I think that's one of the main things that students will tell me, is that they get to a place with their work and they just get stuck. They don't know how to take it any further. And what happens then is that stagnation sets in, right? And you lose your momentum. So you just can't keep going because you've actually fallen into this pit of stagnation. It sounds terrible, but that's what happens. And then you're like, I'm just going to stick it in a corner or put it in a drawer, and I just don't know what I'm going to do with this piece. Often that happens on large canvases because, of course, there's a lot more space to fill, there's a lot more to figure out, a lot more problems to, work out and resolve. So I think sometimes just working small on little pieces like this is a really helpful way to move through and develop different strategies to kind of deal with similar problems that will come up even in your larger pieces, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. So what I'm going to do is we're going to head back into the studio, and I'm actually going to work on the flat. now, because I want to have a little bit more control over some of the techniques that I use. So I'm not going to be working on the wall. You won't see my face, but you'll hear my voice. And so we'll actually be working on several of these pieces on a table, and I'll be taking you through some of the ways that I could make the next move to resolve some of the issues that we've come up with. So we'll be looking at transformation. We'll be looking at again, balance and embracing the contrast, and we'll be adding a few more techniques, such as looking at glazing briefly and a little bit of collage. So let's go have some fun and let's see what we can do with a few of these pieces. I will also be taking one of these pieces, the one that I feel is the most resolved at the end of this lesson, and I will be taking that forward into the new class, Abstract Mojo, and we will be creating or recreating or using that piece as a jumping off point, as an inspiration for a large work on canvas. So I'm really excited to kind of take this into the larger class as well. So come on over, we're going to head into the studio and we're going to have some fun. Okay, so I've chosen this little piece to begin with, and this is probably one of the ones that I feel is working in the best way so far. And what I wanted to do with this one is just show you how sometimes adding a little bit of a collage element will actually really bring something new to the piece. So we'll be adding a little design. I'm using some just basic matte medium. So any kind of gel medium or matte medium will be handy for this part. So we're just going to use a little bit of the matte medium, basically as our glue, as our collage glue. And one of my favorite things to collage with is, we call them serviettes here in Australia, but I know a lot of people call them napkins in other parts. So there are lots and lots of beautiful patterned napkins that you can get your hands on. And all you need to make sure of is that when you're about to collage with them, that you actually just have a look and see whether there are 2 or 3 ply to your napkin, and you want to take all of that backing paper off so that you're just ending up with the one layer that has the design on it. So I've chosen a napkin, a pattern napkin that has colors that kind of work with, they're in the same color family as what I have going on here on this piece. And so I also wanted to illustrate that contrast is also about size. So I'm going to apply 3 pieces of this same patterned napkin, but I wouldn't go ahead and just apply 3 large pieces that were exactly the same shape. So we want some diversity within the work as well. So just to make it easy, I've kind of torn 3 pieces that are large, medium, and small, okay? And then just, spend some time kind of moving them around and seeing where they might feel right to you. Often one of the ways that I'll work is I'll work with the initial large piece, because obviously that's going to make, quite a lot of difference to the piece that you're working on. So I'll find my placement for that piece first, and then I just use a little thing in my head that I have where I take the next piece and I just take it somewhere to the diagonal opposite, okay? So I've got this piece here, this piece, perhaps somewhere over here, and then this little piece somewhere within the mix, but not on the same plane as either of these. So what I mean by that is I'm not going to have it like coming to exactly the same place as this one or the same level down below as this one. I'm going to put it somewhere kind of in the middle. And the other thing I like to do when I'm working with the with the napkins with collage is sometimes just find a part where there's like a harsh edge. So there's an edge here between the green and this other Payne's Grey ink underneath, and just break that up a little bit by placing the piece where the 2 lines connect. Then I'm going to add one more piece of collage, and this is just a piece of Chinese script. And I'm going to maybe use this to tie together, let's see, tie together two of these. So just a slight overlap. We'll move this around just a little bit, and I think I'll overlap in that way. So this is kind of a linking element between this piece of collage and this piece of collage. So let's see how that works when we pop it on. I might move this up just a little tiny touch more. Or down, nope, up. So you're going to use just a wet brush, a clean wet brush, and I'm going to actually glue down, let's see, I'm going to glue this one down first, and then I'm going to overlap the Chinese script and then overlap this one on top. So just a little bit of the matte medium underneath where your collage is going to go, and then take your wet brush that still has a little bit of medium on it and just run it across the top. Don't press too hard because the napkins will start to tear if you press too hard. So I'm going to actually overlap this one here, just adding a little bit of the matte medium, placing the collage element and another layer. So this is a piece of text from a secondhand book, so it's going to act in a different way. It's a little bit more robust than the napkin. And then last piece just up here. So you'll see that the book page sits on top of the piece, whereas the napkins kind of integrate into the piece. And you can try those out and just see, which one do you prefer? I think they both have their place in a piece. I generally prefer working with the napkins, but in this case, I feel like this adds a nice little element of difference as well. So you can see that's just brought a little bit more cohesion to this piece that we're working on. I'm going to put this one aside for a moment, and then we'll come back to it once this collage has dried, and we'll add another layer to another one of the pieces. Alrighty, so with this little one, I have to be honest and tell you there's not much here that is calling to me at all. There's nothing really that feels, I don't know, I can't really find the sweet spot. And oftentimes what I'll do when I'm working is, there'll be a certain element of the piece that's speaking to me, and that's giving me somewhere that I can move forward from. So with this little one, it's like, okay, nothing's really happening. So sometimes what I like to do when I'm at this point is to come at it with what I see as like a radical transformation. Okay, and I find this exhilarating, and I know that it can also be quite terrifying because I've seen that in my students, but I promise you that once you've done it a few times, you'll catch the exhilaration, you'll catch that element of excitement, and it's about not knowing what comes next. So oftentimes what I'll talk to my students about is living in a state of curiosity, but being more on the side of playful curiosity rather than anxious curiosity. So the two words I often think about are what if. What if I try this? What if I just did this? What if I added this? So try and be in the state of what if, but have this kind of anticipation that the what if could bring something new and amazing. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's fantastic. So what I've just put on my palette here, you'll notice are three very different colors than what we already have on this piece. So we've been working primarily with cool colors over here. So I've just brought in some warmer colors, some flame orange and the acrylic ink, some quinacridone magenta in a golden fluid and some nickel azo gold also in the golden fluid. And I'm going to use these to radically transform this little piece to give it a whole new feel by just pulling a glaze over. And so these paints and inks lend themselves to transparent glazes quite beautifully. And a glaze will help to just unify what's going on underneath. Now, if you like, you can use water to actually add into the paint and to thin it down just a little bit more. So I'm just adding some of the matte medium in. So you can use the matte medium or you can use water to do the same thing. If you're working on larger pieces especially, it's probably better to use the matte medium. So let's just pull over a glaze of the magenta in one area, the nickel azo gold in another area. Just noticing, what happens when we do this. You'll see that as the piece is transforming in front of your eyes, it may be that you want to keep a little bit of what was underneath. And often that happens. So don't just go crazy and like pull the glaze across all at once. Notice what's happening as you apply the glaze. Notice how the things and the colors and the shapes underneath change in relationship to what you're doing. And I think I might just keep a little peek through to a couple of areas. Just a couple of geometric areas kind of peeking through from underneath. And that feels quite beautiful to me now. Definitely feels more resolved than it did before. I might like to intensify the magenta, and so you can always add in a little more of the colors that you're using. So just bringing in some areas a slightly deeper glaze, warming it up just that little bit more. And even just trying out different orientations to see whether it might feel better one way or the other. Oftentimes, when the color is deeper at the bottom, it feels more grounded to me to actually turn the piece around. So while we have this one just still in front of us, I feel like we could probably bring some resolution to this fairly quickly. Perhaps just by adding in a little bit of contrast with a white gel pen. So coming into perhaps this darker area here and bringing in some small drawn elements. And then playing around with how would it feel to leave those drawn elements exactly where they are, or how would it feel to connect through from one area to another. So let's try that. Just coming down, bringing a little bit of that drawn element down and connecting it through to another section of dark below. So this is essentially a bridging technique where you're actually joining one area to another using a common element. And of course you could take that through to the next section, or you could leave it just here, or you could actually extend it and have a repetition of that mark in another area. So I like the way that's feeling. Something about this up here, the charcoal on that very first layer, it's just bothering me a little bit. What it feels like it's doing is it feels like it's taking my eye and leading my eye off the page. In fact, these strips up here also kind of pulling my eye all the way around and off the page. If I turned it around, it may not feel like it's doing the same thing. But one thing that I could do would be to just push that back a little bit, that top corner. And one of the tools, well, not really a tool, but one of the things I love to use to do this is just to use a little bit of the white ink and just come around with an irregular border, knocking that corner back a little bit and just strengthening the white around the edges at the same time. Nice clean brush. Sometimes just leaving a little bit of a glimpse through or pulling the white down in some areas. Leaving just a few little pieces to peek through. Maybe letting go of this corner quite a lot if that's the corner that's kind of offending me. Just leaving a couple of little peek throughs to that dark edge. That's better already, isn't it? Coming down here. Just smoothing that white around the edges. Coming into just a couple of areas so that what we have happening around the edges is not completely different to what's going on inside. And what I mean by that is we do have some white on the inside, but this is the paper. It has a different feel and consistency than the white ink, which is more like a veil that we've just placed around the outside. So I want a little bit of that veiled feel kind of inside the piece as well. And it can be quite subtle. Okay, so you can see just with that addition of the white, maybe we'll just add a little bit through here. This piece feels a whole lot more resolved already. In fact, it may even be done. Let's have a look. Lots of yummy things happening in there. Different textures, details and expansive areas. Curvy elements and linear elements, rectangular and circular, contrasting colors in warms and cools, small detailed elements and bolder, larger designs. At this point I would put it aside to dry and then just reassess whether there needs to be any more balance, but I'm really loving it at the moment. This little area here where I did the one last thing, not so sure if that's working just yet, but I'll let it dry, and if I want to intensify the magenta again, I can do that with a magenta glaze after the white is dry. If I start to fiddle with it now and bring the magenta glaze back in over the top, then it's going to turn pink because of the white that I have underneath, which actually could work as well. Let's try it. Why not? Let's just bring a little bit more magenta over the top and see how the addition of a little pink will work. Yeah, I think that's working quite beautifully. So let's put this one aside, and very, very happy with where that's at. Okay, so let's come into this little one, which this one had a lot of elements to it that I was really enjoying at the end of the session yesterday, but it doesn't feel like, it feels like those elements are kind of separate from each other in a way, and especially this large block of white here with the scratch circle through it. So look, while I have a little bit more of these colors on my palette, I'm just going to go ahead and throw a glaze and use these colors up and just see what happens if I pull a little of these warmer colors. So let's just go straight over the top. Tone that white down. You can see how that brings up the texture. In fact, let's do this. Let's just bring this nickel azo gold. There's a little bit of magenta left on my brush. Let's just bring it down across the whole thing and see what happens when you pull a glaze across an entire piece in order to unify it. At the very least, it gives you a place to move forward from where everything in the underlayer is now cohesive. And sometimes just doing this can actually give you a beautiful piece. Let's just even let go of the green up here. Wow, I actually love the way that's looking. Now, if you wanted to, if you feel like you have gone too far ever, a couple of ways that you can bring parts back. One is to just use a paper towel and just rub back. Sometimes what you take away is just as important to a piece as what you put on. So we can put on the glaze, but then we can pull back as well. Another way to actually pull back is to take some alcohol, just some isopropyl alcohol, and you can draw into areas with that. Now, this is going to give me some thin lines into that green. If you use more water with your inks and acrylics rather than the glazing medium, if you use water, you'll get some really beautiful resist effects, and we'll look at that in some of the later works as well. So I'm going to add one more additional element to this one, and it's going to be a contrasting element to what is going on in the center. It's looking very tribal at the moment. It's looking very cave art. And I'm going to try out a mixture of a brighter Rowney blue and some Payne's grey. I don't want it to be too bright. So you can mix these inks and you can mix them with each other, and you can also mix them with acrylic paints. Okay, so let's take kind of equal parts Payne's grey and equal parts Rowney blue, and just get most of that nickel and magenta off the brush. And get your brush. We don't want it too watery, so we want it to be fairly thick. And we're just going to take that nice rich deep blue that we've created, and we're going to pull, instead of white this time, we're going to pull the darker color around the edges. Once again, I want to bring a little bit of that color into the mix in the center. If I've added something new to a piece, I want to make sure that it's integrated into the piece. So I don't want it to like be sticking out as if it's something completely different around the border. So you have to be in this spirit of trying things. So for me, that move didn't really, I don't know, it didn't resolve the whole thing for sure. To me now it just feels like another move. It did something, but it didn't resolve, or it didn't add anything or enhance anything that's on there. So now I have to let that dry, and I have to come back in and see what else I could do. One thing that I could do, let's just have a look at this. Let's turn it upside down again. One thing that I could do while I have this color on my palette is to see if I can add in perhaps some elements of a lighter blue. So using this blue that I've created, adding in a little bit of white ink, dry brush, mixing it around, and seeing what would happen if I bring that lighter element in to the piece. So that definitely adds something. Maybe bringing that lighter element around the edges instead of the dark. Keeping some of the dark and adding a bit of contrast. That feels better already. Don't you think? Definitely feels better. All right. And then what I'm feeling, and this is, of course, you know, we're all different in the way that we approach things. For whatever reason, I always love to push the light and dark. So I'm going to play around with a little bit of pure white right now, just on the edges of this color. So it'll be just an almost white. It'll have just a tinge of blue to it. And I'm going to bring a little bit of that color into the piece. Once again, kind of leaving some areas peeking through to the underneath. You'll see that because the edge is still slightly wet, you get a little bit of blending happening. Just making some organic shapes to kind of give us the little peek throughs to the underlayers. Making these organic shapes, different sizes and shapes as well. And connecting them through to that centerpiece there, kind of scrubbing that white, that bluish white around that center area so that it becomes a feature, but it's also integrated. And just always deciding, you know, how far is enough. I could take this pattern and continue it all the way around, but then it would lose a little bit of what it has, whatever the magic is that it has. So I'm going to change brushes, take just a tiny bit more of that blue and just bring it down to meet the mid-tone blue here. And maybe bring it down to meet this section here. And then just mixing a little bit more white with that darker blue. I'm going to do one more lap around the border and just see how it feels if I lighten it up just a little bit further. Leaving a little bit of the darker and mid-tone blue. And yeah, I think I'm liking that contrast a whole bunch more. So if you wanted some very small details in this piece, you could then grab a gel pen or whatever you have on hand in the same color family. I have a Sharpie right here, so I'm going to see how that feels if I just add in just some small details in lighter blue down the edge there, and perhaps some tiny, tiny little dots up through this darker area here. So again, you've got your contrast light against dark, and I'm feeling much happier with this piece now as well. So coming back to this little piece with the collage elements, what I want to do is just a very simple, I'm going to keep the color harmony in this one, so I'm going to keep with the cool colors. And I just wanted to show you how we can actually use the fluid acrylic, so this is the turquoise and the golden fluid, to actually pull a glaze across the top of the napkins and just push back the design a little bit. So it's still there, it's still integrated in the piece, but it's going to be changed up and pushed way, way back. So let's just pull this, maybe add a little bit of matte medium. I don't want to get any hard edges. So we'll just pull this glaze around. With the matte medium, adding a few more drops of matte medium as we move around the piece. So that we get a softer glaze on one side to the other. So our deepest glaze is where we started, over here on this side. There's still some paint on my brush. I'm moving that around to the other side. I'm avoiding the middle because charcoal will always still smudge, okay? So if you want your lines to still be clear, if you've used charcoal, oops, then you're not going to want to push a brush over those lines. But I kind of like how this is working. Now there are some brush marks in this glaze. So if we come down here, you can see the brush marks, okay? If you wanted to get rid of those, you could let it dry just a little bit. And I mean, they're not offensive to me, but you could let it dry just a little bit, and then you could bring in just a little bit of paper towel and rub back. A lot of the brush marks that you can see are actually the texture of the paint underneath. So just play around with that wiping back. You can also use a baby wipe to wipe back, so you'll just get a different feel if you use the baby wipe compared to the napkin. You still can see the design, but you now have this strong glaze over the top. You could also pull that back using a baby wipe. So let's just have a look. Actually, don't mind smudging up those lines a little. I like that. And now just for something a little bit different, we're going to keep this irregular border, and rather than bringing the white around it as I did with the other, I'm going to just bring in a drawn element with a loose scribbly line, taking my white gel pen and just letting my hand wander around the outside edges a bunch of times so that we create this kind of meandering line. Really just releasing the pen to do its own thing. And it will skip and it will hit and miss depending on whether you have wet paint underneath areas. And let it just do that. Let it just do what it wants to do. Just going to come around a bunch of times here. It's just going to give you something, just a different element again than the softer border. Perhaps you want to scoot it around in one corner, create slightly more of a design element, which is really nice. And then if you like, you can take a wet brush and you can just, let's bring you in a little bit and just show you. Take a little bit of the outer line of the gel pen and just add a little water and soften the outer edges. My brush is still a little bit wet. Or, of course, you could bring in a little of the white ink and just clean up a couple of the edges, leaving the scribbly border and just bringing in a little bit of the ink around the outside edge of the gel pen. Once again, if you're bringing in an element like this where the white is a lot brighter than the white of the page, then you're going to want to think about, is there anywhere within the piece that you might like to have a repetition of that brighter white? If at some point you notice, as I just have, that some of your collage element is lifting, it's probably just because you didn't have enough of the gel medium on underneath in the first place. So just this little area here is lifting. So I'll just let that dry, then I'll add a little more gel medium underneath and get that glued down again. And then perhaps because we've got such a strong element now of the gel pen around the edges, it might be a good idea just to bring a little bit of that gel pen into the actual design area of the piece as well, in just a couple of areas. So perhaps I could bring it through, let's see, doesn't need to be a lot. And I think I'm pretty happy with this one as well. So I do hope you've enjoyed this lesson. We're going to move on to looking at some apps. So just a really short introduction to how I work with apps to manipulate images to then create abstractions. So I'm really excited about that as well. And of course this will be a small glimpse into what will be a larger segment in my Abstract Mojo class. So I'm going to leave these three pieces where they're at. I'm really happy with how they've evolved. So we've got this little one here with the warm colours over the top of the cool. We've got this one here with a more complementary palette, and this one here that had that kind of earthy, rusty feel, and then we've actually brought in the complementary blues. I hope that I've been able to show you some things that you didn't know before. I hope that you've enjoyed the abstract approaches and using the embracing the contrast. And I'm going to add one more class into this this free mini class for you, and we're going to be looking at apps and how I use apps to come up with ideas for abstract paintings. So this will be a mini glimpse into those techniques. So you can look for more of these techniques in my Abstract Mojo class, and I hope you have fun with it.